Part 1. The woman everyone forgot. Eldermere was the kind of village people admired briefly while passing through, and then forgot almost immediately afterward. There were no dramatic cliffs, no famous estates, no grand history tourists cared to photograph. Only narrow country roads lined with hedges, soft green hills rolling quietly beyond the cottages, and a church whose ancient bell sounded every evening with gentle certainty. It was peaceful. Perhaps too peaceful. Miss Marple often believed extremely quiet villages resembled calm ponds. The surface appeared still and pleasant, but beneath the water old things settled heavily, where nobody wished to disturb them. She arrived in Eldermere on a grey October afternoon to visit an old acquaintance, Mrs. Edith Warren, who had recently developed what doctors called persistent nerves and what Miss Marple privately described as loneliness. People vanish into themselves in villages like this, Edith explained sadly, while pouring tea beside the cottage window, especially after autumn begins. Quite true, perhaps. Eldermere possessed fewer than 300 residents, most of whom had known one another since childhood. Conversations moved carefully there. People spoke politely, smiled warmly, and avoided unpleasant subjects with practiced skill, which was precisely why Miss Marple noticed the silence immediately. It began during her second evening in the village when Mrs. Warren casually mentioned the recent death of the local postmistress. "Poor Clara Hensley," Edith murmured while adjusting knitting needles. "Such a shame." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple looked up quietly. Was she elderly? Oh no. Edith hesitated strangely. Not particularly. Ill, perhaps? Another hesitation. She suffered from the heart, apparently. Interesting, perhaps, because Edith Warren spoke too quickly afterward, changing subjects with visible relief. Most curious. The following morning, Miss Marple walked slowly through Eldermere's narrow lanes beneath pale autumn sunlight, while villagers moved through ordinary routines. Milk carts rattled softly across cobblestones, children hurried towards school, shopkeepers arranged produce outside tiny storefronts. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet when Miss Marple gently mentioned Clara Hensley during conversation at the bakery, something peculiar happened. People became uncomfortable, not dramatic discomfort. Subtle, eyes lowered, voices shifted, and subjects changed. Interesting indeed. The baker's wife smiled too brightly. Terribly sad, of course. Then immediately discussed weather. At the butcher's shop, an elderly farmer muttered, "Best not dwell on unfortunate things." Interesting indeed. Best not dwell. Miss Marple heard variations of the same phrase 3 separate times before noon. Very curious. Clara Hensley had apparently served as Eldermere's postmistress nearly 15 years. According to villagers, she was quiet, unmarried, dependable, and almost painfully shy. Exactly the sort of woman communities overlooked easily. Yet everyone now seemed oddly eager to erase her memory entirely. Interesting indeed. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the tiny village church where preparations for the upcoming harvest supper filled the hall with flowers and polished silverware. Reverend Matthew Cole greeted her warmly beside the altar steps. A pleasure meeting one of Edith Warren's old friends. The vicar appeared kind-faced, though deeply tired beneath the eyes. Interesting indeed. Village clergymen frequently carried secrets nobody imagined. Miss Marple spoke gently. "I understand your postmistress passed away recently." There it was again. The brief silence, the careful expression. "Yes." Reverend Cole folded prayer sheets unnecessarily. "A tragic shock. She died during a church gathering?" The vicar nodded slowly. "Small committee meeting for winter charity planning." Interesting indeed. "How unfortunate." "Yes." No elaboration offered. Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. "Were many people present?" "Only 6. Interesting indeed. A small room, a sudden death, and now nobody wished discussing it." "How exactly did she become ill?" asked Miss Marple softly. Reverend Cole hesitated visibly. "She collapsed quite suddenly." "Doctor certain it was natural?" "Yes, again too quickly perhaps. Entirely natural." "Interesting indeed." Then why the unease? Before Miss Marple could continue, another woman entered carrying flower arrangements for the church hall. Mrs. Lydia Trent. Interesting indeed. Tall, elegant, perhaps 50, with composed grey eyes and the confident manner of someone accustomed to village authority. "Miss Marple," the vicar said politely, This is Lydia Trent from Ashcombe House." Mrs. Trent smiled warmly, though something guarded lingered beneath it. "We've heard much about your famous observations. Ah dear, how unfortunate when reputations arrived first." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "One simply notices ordinary things." Interesting perhaps because Lydia Trent's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Fear? Caution perhaps. As conversation continued politely regarding church decorations and village weather, Miss Marple noticed something curious. Nobody mentioned Clara Hensley again. Not once. Even when silence naturally allowed opportunity, both Reverend Cole and Lydia Trent carefully guided discussion elsewhere. Interesting indeed. Very interesting. Later that evening, Miss Marple finally visited the small post office cottage where Clara Hensley had lived alone. The building stood near the village green beneath large chestnut trees dropping autumn leaves across the path. Closed now, naturally. Yet something about the cottage felt abandoned too quickly. Interesting indeed. Windows already emptied, curtains removed, flower pots neglected, as though Eldamere wished erasing Clara Hensley immediately after burial. Miss Marple paused thoughtfully beside the garden gate, then noticed movement nearby. An elderly man sat quietly upon the bench near the green feeding crumbs to birds. Mr. Arthur Bellamy. Mrs. Warren had mentioned him earlier, a retired railway clerk known for rarely speaking. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple approached gently. "Lovely evening." "Yes." Silence followed. Then unexpectedly Arthur Bellamy spoke again. They shouldn't have rushed clearing her cottage. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple sat beside him quietly. "You knew Miss Hensley well?" The old man shrugged faintly. "She was kind. Not love, not friendship perhaps. Simple respect. Interesting indeed." "Did she have family?" "No." Arthur Bellamy scattered additional crumbs slowly across fallen leaves. "People ignored Clara mostly." His voice lowered slightly. "Until she died." Interesting statement. "And afterward?" The old man looked toward the darkened post office windows. "Afterward they wanted silence." There it was again. Silence. Miss Marple folded her gloves carefully. "Why?" Arthur Bellamy hesitated visibly. "Fear, perhaps. Or loyalty." Then quietly, "Because Clara saw things." Interesting indeed. "What sort of things?" "She handled letters." The old man glanced cautiously around the empty green. "People forget postmistresses notice more than villagers realise." "Very interesting indeed." "Did Clara mention concerns before her death?" "No." Arthur swallowed hard. "But the day before she died, she argued with someone outside the church hall." Interesting indeed. "Who?" The old man's face tightened instantly. "I didn't say that." Fear now genuine. Before Miss Marple could continue, footsteps approached sharply across the green. Lydia Trent appeared carrying market parcels beneath the fading evening light. Interesting timing indeed. Arthur Bellamy immediately fell silent. Interesting indeed. Mrs. Trent smiled pleasantly. "Out walking, Miss Marple?" "Yes." Her eyes drifted briefly toward Arthur Bellamy. Something passed silently between them. Not affection, not friendship. Warning, perhaps. Interesting indeed. "Poor Mr. Bellamy spends too much time dwelling on sad matters," Lydia said lightly. "One must move forward after tragedies." Interesting phrase again. Move forward. Do not dwell. Let silence settle. Miss Marple smiled gently. Human beings often prefer forgetting unpleasant truths. For one brief moment, Lydia Trent's calm expression faltered. Interesting indeed. Only slightly, but enough. Then it vanished instantly beneath another graceful smile. "Good night, Miss Marple." As Lydia walked away through drifting autumn leaves, Arthur Bellamy whispered without looking upward. "She took something from Clara's cottage the morning after the funeral. Interesting indeed." Miss Marple remained very still. "What did she take?" "I don't know." His voice trembled faintly. "But it looked like a letter." There it was, the missing sealed letter. And suddenly Miss Marple understood something deeply troubling about Eldamere. The village did not merely wish forgetting Clara Hensley. Someone was making certain she stayed forgotten. The letter that vanished rain arrived during the night and settled heavily across Eldamere by morning. The village looked softer somehow beneath grey skies and drifting mist. Water gathered along narrow lanes while smoke curled lazily from cottage chimneys. Everything appeared peaceful in the quiet, melancholy way English villages often did during autumn. Yet beneath that calm surface, Miss Marple sensed tension growing steadily. Interesting indeed. At breakfast, Mrs. Edith Warren spoke unusually little while buttering toast with nervous precision. Finally she sighed. "You've been asking questions about Clara Hensley." "Not really a question, perhaps." "Yes." Edith avoided eye contact. "My dear Jane, Eldamere is not accustomed to unpleasant gossip." "Interesting indeed." "Truth and gossip are quite different things," Miss Marple replied gently. "Yes, but villagers rarely understand the difference." "Quite true, perhaps." Miss Marple stirred tea thoughtfully. "Why does everyone become uncomfortable when Clara's death is mentioned?" Edith hesitated visibly. "Because it upset people." "How?" "She died suddenly in church." Edith lowered her voice. "That sort of thing unsettles villagers." "Interesting, perhaps, but insufficient. People feared scandal here more than death itself." Miss Marple changed direction quietly. "Who attended the meeting that evening?" Again hesitation. Interesting indeed. "Reverend Cole, Lydia Trent, Dr. Forsyth, Clara herself and 2 others from the charity committee." "Who?" "Mrs. Agnes Fuller and Mr. Philip Doran." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple recognised the names already. Agnes Fuller operated the village dress shop while Philip Doran managed Eldamere's small bank branch. Respectable people then. Always interesting. "And nobody thought Clara appeared ill beforehand?" "No." Edith looked suddenly uncomfortable again. She actually seemed rather upset that evening, according to Agnes Fuller. Interesting indeed. "Upset about what?" "I don't know." But perhaps Edith suspected more than she admitted. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited Eldamere's tiny dress shop where bells chimed softly above the entrance and bolts of fabric lined narrow walls from floor to ceiling. Mrs. Agnes Fuller greeted her politely, though visible nervousness flickered beneath her smile. Interesting indeed. "Such dreadful weather," Agnes murmured while folding cloth unnecessarily. "Yes." Miss Marple examined ribbons thoughtfully. Though villages often reveal more during rainstorms. People remain indoors and think too much." The shopkeeper laughed weakly. "Interesting indeed." Miss Marple spoke casually. "You were present when poor Clara Hensley died." There it was again. The silence, the careful breathing. "Yes." "Very shocking. Terribly." Agnes turned away, pretending to arrange buttons. "Interesting indeed." "Did Clara seem unwell beforehand?" "No." "Too quickly, perhaps." "Only distracted." "Distracted how?" The woman hesitated. "She kept looking toward Lydia Trent." "Interesting indeed." "Why?" "I couldn't possibly say, but she could perhaps." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Mrs. Fuller, people notice remarkable things during village meetings." Agnes swallowed nervously. "Interesting indeed." Then finally, Claire and Lydia argued briefly before others arrived. There it was again. Interesting indeed. "About what?" "I only heard fragments." Agnes lowered her voice instinctively despite the empty shop. "You can't hide it forever," Clara said. "Interesting indeed." "And Lydia?" "She told Clara to stop being foolish." "Interesting indeed." A quiet postmistress threatening respectable Lydia Trent inside Church Hall, before sudden death afterward. Very interesting indeed. Did anyone else hear this conversation? "I don't know." But fear suggested perhaps yes. Miss Marple purchased unnecessary ribbon before leaving thoughtfully through the rain. Interesting indeed. Lydia Trent now sat firmly at the centre of everything, yet perhaps too obviously, and human beings frequently suspected powerful personalities first because they dominated attention naturally. But real guilt often hid elsewhere. The village doctor lived beside the river beyond Eldamere Bridge, in a stone cottage surrounded by wet autumn gardens. Dr. Stephen Forsyth welcomed Miss Marple with tired courtesy. Middle-aged, careful, intelligent perhaps, and deeply uneasy. Interesting indeed. "You examined Clara Hensley after her collapse?" "Yes." The doctor removed spectacles slowly. "Heart failure." "Certain?" He looked directly toward her. "Yes." "Interesting indeed." Too firm again. Miss Marple folded her umbrella neatly. "Did Miss Hensley suffer known heart problems?" "A mild condition. Serious enough causing sudden death?" "Possibly." "Interesting wording. Not certainty, possibility. Interesting indeed. The doctor walked toward the window overlooking rain-dark fields. Villagers dislike disturbances, Miss Marple. An admission, perhaps. Truth often disturbs people. Interesting indeed. Silence lingered briefly. Then Miss Marple asked softly, was there truly no reason requesting post-mortem examination? The doctor's shoulders tightened slightly. Interesting indeed. Yet his voice lacked conviction entirely. Interesting indeed. Before leaving, Miss Marple noticed something curious upon Dr. Forsyth's desk. An unopened envelope addressed in Clara Hensley's handwriting. Interesting indeed. The doctor saw her glance immediately and covered it casually with medical papers. Far too casually, perhaps. Outside, rain intensified while Miss Marple walked slowly back through Eldermere, reflecting upon frightened villagers and missing letters. Then suddenly another thought arrived sharply. Interesting indeed. If Clara handled everyone's correspondence for 15 years, she likely knew every hidden relationship within the village. Affairs, debts, secrets, scandals. Postmistresses observed lives quietly through envelopes and forwarding addresses, and shy, unnoticed women often heard more than anyone imagined. Very interesting indeed. That afternoon, Reverend Matthew Cole visited Edith Warren's cottage unexpectedly. Interesting indeed. Clergymen rarely called spontaneously during rainstorms unless troubled. The vicar appeared exhausted beneath damp coat and pale expression. Mrs. Warren said Miss Marple is staying here. Yes. He hesitated awkwardly near the doorway. I hoped perhaps you might stop asking questions regarding Clara Hensley. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple looked at him gently. Why? Reverend Cole removed wet gloves slowly. Because Eldermere needs peace. Interesting phrase. Peace, silence, forgetfulness, all very similar indeed. And truth threatens that peace? The vicar sighed heavily. You don't understand village life here. No? There are old wounds. His voice softened tiredly. Old mistakes. Interesting indeed. Connected to Clara? No. Too quickly, perhaps. Miss Marple remained silent. Eventually silence itself forced people speaking further. Quite useful indeed. Finally, Reverend Cole lowered his voice. Clara became troubled during recent months. How? She believed certain people behaved dishonourably. Interesting indeed. Did they? The vicar closed his eyes briefly. That depends whether one values truth above kindness. There it was. Very interesting indeed, because only guilty people describe truth as unkind. Before Miss Marple could continue further, sharp knocking interrupted conversation. Arthur Bellamy stood outside drenched by rain and visibly shaken. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple, his voice trembled faintly. Someone's inside Clara's cottage. Interesting indeed. Within minutes they hurried through rain toward the darkened post office near the village green. A faint upstairs light glowed behind curtains despite the building officially standing empty. Interesting indeed. Inspector would have been sensible perhaps. But villagers rarely waited sensibly during storms. Arthur Bellamy pointed nervously upward. I saw movement. Reverend Cole looked deeply alarmed. Who has keys? Lydia Trent helped clear belongings after the funeral, Arthur muttered. Interesting indeed. The front door stood slightly open. Rain whispered softly against windows while Miss Marple entered the silent cottage alongside the vicar and Arthur Bellamy. Furniture remained half covered with sheets, boxes stacked carelessly near walls, and upstairs. Footsteps. Interesting indeed. Reverend Cole climbed first. Who's there? Silence followed. Then sudden movement above. Miss Marple reached the landing moments later, just as a shadow disappeared through the rear bedroom doorway. Interesting indeed. Arthur Bellamy gasped sharply. It's her! Lydia Trent stood beside Clara Hensley's bedroom desk, holding papers tightly against her chest. Rain-dark wind blew through open window behind her. Interesting indeed. For one brief moment genuine fear crossed Lydia's face before calm returned carefully. "What are you doing here?" Reverend Cole demanded sharply. Lydia straightened instantly, collecting personal effects for charity donation. Interesting indeed. At night, secretly, during rainstorm. How charitable indeed. Miss Marple's eyes moved quietly toward the papers in Lydia's hands. One envelope remained sealed with dark red wax. Interesting indeed. The missing letter, perhaps? Lydia noticed her gaze immediately and tightened fingers around it. Then softly, "Some things are better left unread, Miss Marple." Very interesting indeed. The secret, beneath the church bells. For several moments nobody moved inside Clara Hensley's upstairs bedroom. Rain beat steadily against the open window while Lydia Trent stood perfectly still beside the desk, holding the sealed envelope like something alive. Interesting indeed. Reverend Matthew Cole recovered first. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said sharply. Lydia's expression hardened faintly. "Nor should any of us." Interesting answer, perhaps. Not denial, not explanation. Miss Marple noticed Arthur Bellamy watching Lydia with unmistakable fear. Interesting indeed. Fear not merely of scandal, perhaps. Something older, something deeper. The room itself reflected Clara Hensley perfectly. Simple, orderly, almost painfully modest. Books arranged neatly beside the bed, pressed flowers inside tiny frames, a sewing basket untouched near the chair. The sort of room belonging to someone who spent years trying not to inconvenience others. And yet somehow this quiet woman now frightened an entire village after death. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple spoke gently. Was Clara expecting this letter to be found? Lydia's eyes flashed immediately. "I don't know what you mean." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple nodded softly toward the envelope. "You've risked coming here secretly during a storm to retrieve it. Therefore it matters greatly." Silence settled heavily. Then Reverend Cole stepped forward. "Lydia, perhaps Miss Marple deserves honesty." Interesting indeed. The vicar already knew something. Lydia looked toward him sharply. "And destroy what little peace remains?" Interesting phrase again. Peace. Always peace. Human beings committed remarkable sins protecting peace. Miss Marple folded her gloves carefully. "My dear Mrs. Trent, villages are rarely damaged by truth itself," she paused gently. "Only by the effort required hiding it." Interesting indeed. For one brief moment, Lydia looked exhausted beyond words, then suddenly older too. Arthur Bellamy spoke unexpectedly from the doorway. She wrote names. Silence crashed through the room. Interesting indeed. Lydia turned pale instantly. "What?" Arthur swallowed nervously. "Clara told me she finally intended writing everything down. Very interesting indeed." Miss Marple looked quietly toward the sealed envelope. Names, then. Important names, perhaps. "Whose names?" asked Reverend Cole softly. Arthur Bellamy shook his head miserably. "She never said." Interesting indeed. Lydia moved suddenly toward the fireplace, instinctively perhaps, as though intending throwing the letter into flames. But Miss Marple spoke before she could move further. "If the contents truly threatened nobody innocent," she said quietly, "you would not be frightened of reading them aloud." There it was. Lydia froze completely. Interesting indeed. Outside, church bells rang softly through rain-dark evening, announcing 7 o'clock across Eldermere, a strangely mournful sound. Finally Lydia lowered herself slowly into Clara's chair beside the desk. She should never have kept it. Interesting indeed. Not should never have written it. Kept it. Important difference. Reverend Cole looked deeply troubled. What exactly did Clara know? Lydia stared toward rain-streaked glass without answering immediately. Then softly, "About Thomas Vale." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple recognized the name instantly. Mrs. Warren mentioned Thomas Vale earlier in passing, a young soldier from Eldermere who supposedly died during the war nearly 30 years ago. A village hero? Interesting indeed. Arthur Bellamy closed his eyes briefly. "Dear God!" "Yes," Lydia whispered bitterly. "Exactly." Miss Marple remained very still, because suddenly Eldermere's strange silence acquired entirely different meaning. Not recent scandal, perhaps. Old scandal. Very old. "What happened to Thomas Vale?" she asked gently. Lydia laughed once without humour. "He didn't die a hero." Interesting indeed. Reverend Cole sank heavily onto the bed. "You promised never discussing this again." Interesting indeed. Again. Meaning multiple people already knew. Lydia's composure cracked visibly for the first time. Clara forced it. Her voice trembled faintly. She found letters. Letters again. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple looked quietly around Clara's small orderly bedroom, a shy postmistress sorting village correspondence year after year, observing, forwarding addresses, military notices, private envelopes. Yes, such women often discovered truths accidentally. What sort of letters? Asked Miss Marple softly. Lydia hesitated, then finally handed over the sealed envelope. Interesting indeed. The wax seal bore Clara Hensley's initials carefully pressed in dark red. Miss Marple opened it slowly while silence filled the room. Inside rested several folded papers tied neatly together. One was clearly Clara's handwriting. Another much older letter appeared yellowed with age. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple unfolded Clara's note first. If anyone reads this after my death, then perhaps something terrible has finally happened. I kept silent for many years because Eldamere believed silence was kindness, but silence only protected people who lied. Interesting indeed. She continued reading quietly while others watched. Thomas Vale did not die in battle as the village believes. He returned home alive after the war, and someone in Eldamere caused his death afterward. Silence settled heavily through the room. Arthur Bellamy looked physically ill. Reverend Cole whispered, "Clara," Miss Marple continued, "I discovered the truth by accident through old redirected post kept inside storage records. Thomas intended exposing certain villagers for wartime theft and black market dealings before he vanished. Someone stopped him permanently. Everyone else chose silence because the scandal would have destroyed respected families here. There it was. Interesting indeed. Respectability again. Always respectability." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "And Clara discovered this recently?" Lydia nodded faintly. "She found old postal records while clearing storage boxes last month. Interesting indeed. A forgotten letter, perhaps. A hidden forwarding notice. Small accidents exposed enormous truths sometimes." Miss Marple unfolded the older yellowed paper carefully. Interesting indeed. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Thomas Vale himself. "If anything happens to me, remember this. They are not frightened of prison. They are frightened of disgrace." Ah, very interesting indeed. No names appeared, unfortunately, only initials. LTMCAB. Interesting indeed. Lydia Trent, Matthew Cole, Arthur Bellamy. The room became utterly still. Arthur Bellamy looked shattered. Reverend Cole closed his eyes painfully, and Lydia Trent whispered, "This is why Eldamere wanted silence." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple studied the three faces quietly, and in not murderers perhaps, but witnesses certainly. "Thomas Vale discovered wartime corruption?" she asked softly. Arthur Bellamy answered weakly. "Food ration theft, black market supplies." His voice shook. "Several villagers involved." Interesting indeed. "Who?" Silence followed again. Then Reverend Cole said quietly, "People who are long dead now." Interesting answer. Perhaps true. Perhaps not entirely. "And Thomas threatened exposing them?" Lydia nodded. "Yes." "What happened afterward?" Nobody answered immediately. Interesting indeed. Then Arthur Bellamy whispered, "He disappeared before speaking publicly." Interesting indeed. Disappeared. Not died heroically overseas. Vanished quietly inside Eldamere itself. Miss Marple folded the letters carefully. "And Clara intended revealing this?" "Yes," Lydia said bitterly. She believed truth mattered more than peace." Interesting indeed. "And you disagreed?" Lydia looked directly toward Miss Marple. "I watched this village survive war, poverty, and scandal, because people protected one another." Her voice hardened. "Sometimes silence is mercy." "Ah, yes. The old dangerous belief." Miss Marple spoke gently. "No, my dear. Silence is usually fear wearing respectable clothing." For a moment nobody spoke. Then suddenly Arthur Bellamy whispered something barely audible. She knew who killed Thomas. Silence crashed once more through Clara Hensley's tiny bedroom. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple looked sharply toward him. "What?" Arthur's face had gone pale as ash. Clara found another letter before she died. His hands trembled visibly. One naming the killer. Very interesting indeed. "Where is it now?" asked Reverend Cole sharply. Arthur Bellamy looked toward Lydia Trent, and Lydia slowly closed her eyes. Interesting indeed, because suddenly everyone in the room understood the same terrible possibility simultaneously. The missing letter Clara discovered before dying may have been the reason she died too. The name hidden in the letter. No one slept particularly well in Eldermere that night. Rain continued until dawn, washing the village lanes clean while leaving something heavier behind inside people's minds. By morning, whispers had already begun drifting quietly between cottages despite everyone pretending otherwise. Human beings often discussed forbidden things most enthusiastically while claiming silence. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple sat beside Edith Warren's fireplace shortly after breakfast, rereading Clara Hensley's letters carefully, while Mrs. Warren paced nervously near the curtains. "This is dreadful," Edith murmured. "Absolutely dreadful." "Yes." "You think Clara was murdered?" Miss Marple folded the papers thoughtfully. "I think Clara frightened someone." "Interesting indeed. Not always the same thing, perhaps, but often closely related." Edith lowered her voice instinctively. "If people learn Thomas Vale was killed here—" She hesitated miserably. "It would destroy Eldermere." Interesting phrase again. Destroy the village. Damage peace. Ruin respectability. Curious how often communities feared scandal more than actual crime. Miss Marple spoke gently. "My dear Edith, if truth can destroy something, then perhaps it was never very strong." Before Edith could reply, sharp knocking interrupted them. Inspector Daniel Harcourt entered moments later, carrying wet coat and visible irritation. Interesting indeed. The county police at last. Tall, sharp-faced, perhaps 45, with the tired expression common among men forced repeatedly dealing with village secrets disguised as good manners. Mrs. Warren looked alarmed immediately. "Inspector? I apologize for the intrusion." Harcourt removed gloves briskly. "But apparently Miss Marple has involved herself in Clara Hensley's death." Interesting indeed. News travelled quickly in Eldermere. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only through curiosity?" "Yes." The inspector sighed dryly. "I've heard curiosity described that way before. Interesting indeed." He sat opposite her and glanced toward Clara's letters upon the table. "Reverend Cole informed me about the documents discovered last night." Interesting indeed. And now half the village believes wartime murder scandals are about to emerge from nowhere." His expression darkened. "Frankly, Miss Marple, I'd prefer facts." "Reasonable, perhaps." Miss Marple handed him Thomas Vale's old letter quietly. The inspector read it slowly. Interesting indeed. His expression changed almost imperceptibly near the initials. "L.T.M.C.A.B., he murmured. "Lydia Trent, Matthew Cole, Arthur Bellamy," Edith whispered nervously. Inspector Harcourt looked toward Miss Marple. "You think one of them killed Thomas Vale?" Interesting indeed. The inspector blinked slightly. "Yes, no. I think Thomas suspected them connected somehow." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "But not necessarily guilty of murder." Interesting indeed. "Then who is?" "Unknown." The inspector sighed again. "At least that remains sensible." Miss Marple smiled softly. "My dear inspector, villages rarely hide crime successfully forever. Human beings talk too much." "Quite true indeed." He leaned back thoughtfully. "Dr. Forsyth insists Clara died naturally." "Do you believe him?" "No." Interesting indeed. Direct honesty at last. "Why not?" "Because Forsyth requested Clara cremated unusually quickly." Harcourt's eyes narrowed faintly. "And because villagers behaved oddly from the beginning." Interesting indeed. The inspector continued quietly. "No one seemed surprised by her death." He paused thoughtfully. "Disturbed, yes. But not surprised." Interesting indeed. Meaning perhaps Clara feared something openly before dying. Miss Marple looked toward the rain-streaked windows. "Has anyone located the second letter Arthur Bellamy mentioned?" "No." Interesting indeed. The missing letter again. Always the missing letter. Inspector Harcourt stood slowly. "I'm reopening Thomas Vale's case officially." He looked toward Miss Marple carefully. "Which means I'd appreciate fewer amateur investigations meanwhile." Miss Marple smiled politely. Naturally, she intended continuing immediately. That afternoon she visited Eldermere Cemetery, where autumn leaves drifted softly across old gravestones beneath pale grey skies. Interesting place perhaps for reflection. Thomas Vale's memorial stood near the church wall beneath weathered ivy. Not a grave, technically. Only a memorial stone, missing in action, presumed dead. Interesting indeed. Someone had recently placed fresh flowers there. Miss Marple bent slowly examining them. White chrysanthemums. Interesting indeed. Funeral flowers traditionally, not remembrance flowers. Curious. You notice details too much. The voice came quietly behind her. Miss Marple turned. Dr. Stephen Forsyth stood near the church gate holding black umbrella beneath drifting mist. Interesting indeed. You followed me? The doctor smiled faintly without humour. In villages, people always notice strangers wandering around memorials. Quite true, perhaps. Miss Marple looked again toward Thomas Vale's stone. You knew him? Yes. Interesting indeed. How well? Dr. Forsyth hesitated. We were boys together. Interesting indeed. Something shadowed his expression briefly. Regret, perhaps. Did you believe he died during the war? No. Interesting indeed. Direct honesty again. The doctor walked slowly closer. Thomas returned to Eldamere in 1947. His voice lowered carefully. Very angry, very determined. Because of wartime theft? Yes. Interesting indeed. Who was involved? Dr. Forsyth looked toward the empty churchyard. People were desperate after the war, he sighed heavily. Rationing created ugly opportunities. Interesting indeed. And Thomas intended exposing them? Yes. What happened afterward? The doctor removed spectacles slowly. He vanished. Interesting indeed. Vanished. Always vanished. And villagers accepted the heroic death story instead. Why? Dr. Forsyth's answer came almost immediately. Because it was kinder. Ah, yes, kindness again. Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. My dear doctor, was it kindness to Thomas? Silence settled softly through drifting leaves. Interesting indeed. No, he admitted quietly. There it was, perhaps. The true heart of Eldamere. Not evil exactly. Cowardice. Communities often protected themselves through silence until silence itself became cruelty. Before Miss Marple could continue further, movement near the churchyard hedge caught her attention. Arthur Bellamy. Interesting indeed. The old railway clerk stood partly hidden beneath chestnut trees watching them nervously, then suddenly turned away. Interesting indeed. Mr. Bellamy, called Miss Marple gently. Arthur hesitated visibly before returning slowly toward them. His face looked pale and exhausted. Fear again. Interesting indeed. I shouldn't have spoken yesterday, he muttered shakily. Why not? Asked Miss Marple softly. Because people are angry now. Interesting indeed. Who? Arthur glanced nervously toward Dr. Forsyth, then whispered, She came to my house last night. Interesting indeed. Who came? Lydia Trent. The old man's hands trembled visibly. She wanted the letters. Interesting indeed. What did you tell her? Nothing. But fear suggested otherwise, perhaps. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Mr. Bellamy, did Clara show you the missing letter before she died? Arthur went completely still. Ah, interesting indeed. Finally he whispered, Yes. Dr. Forsyth stared sharply toward him. You said you never read it. I lied. Interesting indeed. Fear caused lies beautifully. Miss Marple spoke gently. What did the letter say? Arthur swallowed hard. It named Thomas Vale's killer. Silence settled heavily through the cemetery. Interesting indeed. And who was named? The old man looked toward the memorial stone with miserable eyes. Then quietly, Reverend Matthew Cole's father. Very interesting indeed. Dr. Forsyth closed his eyes briefly. Dear God. Arthur nodded weakly. Thomas discovered Reverend Cole's father stole ration supplies during the war. His voice shook. They argued beside the river one night after Thomas threatened police. Interesting indeed. And? Arthur looked suddenly close to collapse. Thomas never came home afterward. Miss Marple remained very still. Because now Clara Hensley's death became terribly clear. She discovered proof connecting the beloved former vicar to murder decades earlier, and someone feared that truth emerging publicly even now. Interesting indeed. But Reverend Cole's father died years ago, said Dr. Forsyth quietly. Yes, Arthur whispered. That's why nobody wanted the scandal uncovered. There it was again. Not protecting a murderer now, perhaps. Protecting memory. Protecting village respectability. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward Arthur Bellamy. You kept the letter. The old man froze instantly. Interesting indeed. Because she was correct. Arthur Bellamy slowly reached inside his coat pocket, then withdrew a folded envelope with shaking fingers. There was something else written at the bottom, he whispered miserably. Miss Marple opened it carefully, and immediately understood why Arthur Bellamy looked terrified. Because beneath Thomas Vale's accusation, Clara Hensley had added one final sentence shortly before her death. I believe the person who poisoned me knows this letter exists. The poison in the teacup. The words struck the cemetery silence like a church bell. I believe the person who poisoned me knows this letter exists. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple read the sentence twice while cold autumn winds stirred fallen leaves around Thomas Vale's memorial stone. Dr. Forsyth looked visibly shaken. Arthur Bellamy seemed near collapse entirely. My God, the doctor whispered. Quite. Because suddenly Clara Hensley's death no longer resembled suspicion or village gossip. It resembled murder. Deliberate murder. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. When did Clara write this edition? Arthur swallowed hard. The morning before she died. Interesting indeed. Why didn't you tell police immediately? Fear crossed the old man's face instantly. Because people here wanted silence. His voice trembled faintly. And because I was afraid. Interesting indeed. Fear again. Always fear. Human beings rarely protected killers intentionally at first. Usually they merely protected comfort, routine, reputation, until eventually those things mattered more than truth itself. Dr. Forsyth removed spectacles slowly. If Clara believed she'd been poisoned beforehand, he looked toward Miss Marple sharply. Then she noticed symptoms earlier that day. Interesting indeed. Meaning? Digitalis, perhaps? Slow acting in small doses. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple remembered Clara collapsing during tea at the church committee gathering. Tea? Always interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt arrived at the cemetery less than an hour later, after Dr. Forsyth insisted upon immediate police involvement. The inspector read Clara's added sentence grimly beneath grey afternoon skies. Well, he muttered heavily, that complicates matters considerably. Reasonable, perhaps. Can you exhume the body? Asked Miss Marple gently. Harcourt nodded reluctantly. Yes. Interesting indeed. Eldamere would dislike that enormously. Villagers preferred buried things remaining buried, especially truths. By evening, the entire village buzzed with nervous whispers despite official secrecy attempts. Curtains twitched behind windows while neighbours lingered too long beside gates pretending ordinary conversation. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple sat quietly beside Edith Warren's fire while rain began once more against the cottage windows. Edith herself appeared deeply distressed. "This will ruin Reverend Cole," she whispered miserably. "Why?" "Because his father was beloved here. Interesting indeed. Even beloved men sometimes commit terrible acts. Yes, but exposing it now serves no purpose." There it was again. No purpose, no kindness, no peace. Miss Marple looked toward the flames thoughtfully. "My dear Edith, purpose isn't always the important thing." She paused softly. Sometimes truth matters simply because it belongs to the dead. Interesting indeed. Before Edith could answer, hurried knocking interrupted them sharply. Inspector Harcourt entered, carrying visible urgency. "We found digitalis." Interesting indeed. "Inside Clara Hensley?" asked Miss Marple quietly. "Yes." The inspector removed wet gloves irritably. Enough confirming deliberate poisoning. Murder now undeniable. Edith sank pale-faced into her chair. "Oh, dear God," Inspector Harcourt continued grimly. "Clara likely consumed the poison shortly before the church meeting." "Tea?" asked Miss Marple. "Most likely." Interesting indeed. Small village committee meetings often involve tea poured casually among friends. Perfect opportunity. "Who prepared it?" Miss Marple asked softly. The inspector sighed. "According to witnesses, Reverend Cole made the tea while Mrs. Trent arranged papers." Interesting indeed. Very interesting indeed. Two people directly connected to Thomas Vale's hidden scandal. Perhaps too obvious again. What about Dr. Forsyth? Asked Edith nervously. He arrived later. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt paced slowly before the fire. Unfortunately, Clara's death now connects directly to the missing wartime murder letter. He frowned deeply. If, meaning someone killed her to prevent old truths emerging. But here's the difficulty. Harcourt stopped abruptly. If Reverend Cole's father committed murder decades ago, why poison Clara now? Interesting indeed. Excellent question. The dead old vicar could no longer suffer prison or disgrace personally. So who benefited from continued silence? Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. Perhaps someone feared not the past itself, but what the past might reveal about the present. The inspector looked sharply toward her. Interesting indeed. Yes, he murmured slowly. Perhaps. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked alone through Eldermere despite rain and darkness. Villages changed after murder became official. Silence deepened. Windows glowed suspiciously. An ordinary footstep sounded strangely lonely beneath wet street lamps. Interesting indeed. She paused outside the church hall where Clara Hensley collapsed. Interesting place, perhaps. Committee tables still stood arranged inside behind dark windows, teacups stacked neatly, chairs pushed carefully beneath tables. Ordinary room, extraordinary secrets. Then suddenly movement caught her attention across the lane. Lydia Trent. Interesting indeed. The elegant widow stood beneath the church porch wearing dark coat and carrying umbrella untouched by rain, as though waiting. Miss Marple, Mrs. Trent, Rain whispered steadily between them. For several moments neither woman spoke. Then Lydia said quietly, You think I poisoned Clara? Interesting indeed. Did you? No. Immediate answer, no hesitation. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Then why hide the letters? Lydia looked toward the rain-dark village green. Because Thomas Vale's accusations would destroy people who've already suffered enough. Interesting phrase. People. Plural. Not merely Reverend Cole's dead father, perhaps. Who else was involved in wartime theft? Asked Miss Marple softly. Lydia hesitated visibly. Then, my husband. Interesting indeed. There it is, she whispered bitterly. The ugly little truth. Interesting indeed. Her late husband, Harold Trent, had apparently worked alongside Reverend Cole's father during post-war ration distribution. Respected men, church leaders, village pillars, and secretly corrupt. Interesting indeed. Thomas Vale discovered everything, asked Miss Marple, and threatened exposure. Lydia closed her eyes briefly. Harold begged Matthew's father to confess quietly. Her voice weakened faintly. Instead, they fought beside the river. Interesting indeed. And Thomas disappeared afterward. Interesting perhaps because Lydia still avoided direct accusation. Not, they killed him. Only disappearance. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the church hall windows. Did Clara intend exposing all this publicly? Yes. Then who feared it enough committing murder now? Lydia's expression darkened strangely. You still don't understand, Eldermere? Interesting indeed. No. Villages survive through stories. Her voice lowered carefully. People need believing certain things about themselves. Ah, very interesting indeed. The heroic dead soldier, the honourable vicar, the respectable families. Lydia nodded faintly. Yes, and Clara threatened those stories. Rain intensified softly around them. Then Lydia whispered something unexpected. Clara wasn't frightened for herself? Interesting indeed. What do you mean? She told me someone else would die if the truth emerged. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple went very still. Who? I don't know. But perhaps Lydia suspected. Before further conversation continued, church bells suddenly echoed sharply through rainy darkness. Both women turned instinctively. Interesting indeed. Reverend Matthew Cole stood inside the church doorway watching them. His pale face looked exhausted beyond words. Interesting indeed. The vicar approached slowly beneath dripping umbrellas. I should tell police everything, he said quietly. Interesting indeed. Lydia stared at him sharply. Matthew. No. He looked suddenly older. This has gone too far already. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple watched him carefully. You know what happened to Thomas Vale? The vicar's voice trembled faintly. My father confessed before dying. Silence settled heavily beneath ringing bells. Interesting indeed. He fought with Thomas beside the river. Matthew lowered his eyes painfully. Thomas fell and struck his head upon rocks. Accident, perhaps, or convenient interpretation. Interesting indeed. My father panicked afterward, the vicar whispered. Harold Trent helped conceal the body. Ah, there it was at last, the buried truth beneath Eldermere's peaceful surface. Miss Marple spoke gently, and Clara discovered proof recently. Then why was she murdered? Matthew Cole looked directly toward her, and for the first time genuine fear appeared in his face. Because Clara discovered something else too. The truth Clara never finished writing. Rain continued through the night like soft fingers tapping endlessly against Eldermere's windows. Miss Marple slept very little. Matthew Cole's final words lingered heavily in her thoughts. Because Clara discovered something else too. Interesting indeed. Not merely the hidden death of Thomas Vale 30 years earlier, not simply wartime corruption and buried scandal, something newer perhaps, something dangerous enough causing murder now. By morning, Eldermere felt strained almost beyond endurance. Villagers avoided eye contact openly now. Conversation stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. Even the church bell sounded hesitant beneath grey skies. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple sat beside Edith Warren's breakfast table, while Inspector Harcourt reviewed notes impatiently near the fireplace. Matthew Cole officially confessed his father concealed Thomas Vale's death, the inspector muttered. Though technically proving murder after 30 years will be nearly impossible. Interesting indeed. And Harold Trent helped hide the body, said Miss Marple softly. Inspector Harcourt rubbed tired eyes. Frankly, the whole village seems guilty of something. Quite understandable, perhaps, because silence itself had become collective guilt here. Edith Warren looked deeply distressed. Poor Matthew, she shook her head sadly. Living with such knowledge all these years. Interesting, perhaps, because nobody said poor Thomas Vale anymore. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple stirred tea thoughtfully. My dear Edith, communities often sympathise most with people protecting secrets rather than victims harmed by them. The inspector looked sharply toward her. Interesting indeed. Yes, he admitted quietly. That happens rather often. A constable arrived shortly afterward carrying newly recovered items from Clara Hensley's cottage. Interesting indeed. Most appeared ordinary enough. Address books, old postal receipts, church notices. Then Miss Marple noticed something tucked inside a leather notebook. A half-finished letter written in Clara's careful handwriting. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt unfolded it immediately. If anything happens to me before I speak publicly, people must understand Thomas Vale's death was not the only crime hidden in Eldermere. Someone has lied about the past for many years, and that lie still protects a living person today. The sentence ended abruptly. Interesting indeed. Very interesting indeed. Not the only crime. A living person protected by lies surrounding Thomas Vale. Inspector Harcourt frowned deeply. Meaning? Miss Marple remained silent briefly, because suddenly another thought emerged quietly into place. Interesting indeed. Thomas Vale disappeared after threatening exposure, his death concealed by respected villagers. And afterward Eldermere created a heroic wartime story replacing ugly truth. But perhaps that false story protected more than reputations. Perhaps it protected identity itself. Interesting indeed. Inspector, Miss Marple asked softly, was Thomas Vale married? Harcourt blinked slightly. No. Engaged, perhaps? The inspector checked notes quickly. Yes, he looked surprised. To Eleanor Forsyth. Interesting indeed. Dr. Stephen Forsyth's older sister. Did she remain in Eldermere afterward? No. Harcourt frowned thoughtfully. Left shortly after Thomas disappeared. Interesting indeed. Any children? The inspector looked up sharply now. No official records. Very interesting indeed. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. Because villages hid illegitimacy beautifully once upon a time, especially respectable villages. Edith Warren looked confused. Jane, what are you thinking? Miss Marple answered softly. I think Clara discovered someone in Eldermere isn't who they claim to be. Silence followed. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt stared toward her. You mean false identity? Possibly. The inspector stood immediately. I need to speak with Dr. Forsyth again. Interesting indeed. The doctor received them tensely at his riverside cottage later that afternoon. Rain had finally stopped, though heavy clouds still darkened the fields beyond Eldermere Bridge. Stephen Forsyth appeared exhausted. Interesting indeed. Too exhausted, perhaps, for a man uninvolved directly. Inspector Harcourt placed Clara's unfinished letter upon the table. "You recognise this?" The doctor read silently, then slowly removed spectacles. "Yes." "Interesting indeed." "Clara believed someone still benefited from Thomas Vale's hidden death," said Harcourt sharply. "Who?" Dr. Forsyth looked toward the river beyond his windows. For several moments he said nothing, then quietly, "My sister Eleanor had a child." There it was. Interesting indeed. Edith Warren gasped softly behind them. "A boy," Forsyth continued, "Thomas Vale's son." Interesting indeed. "And?" "Eleanor died shortly after childbirth." Silence settled heavily through the cottage. Interesting indeed. "What happened to the child?" asked Miss Marple gently. The doctor's face tightened painfully. "My father arranged adoption privately." Interesting indeed. Respectable solution, perhaps. Invisible solution, certainly. "Who adopted him?" Stephen Forsyth hesitated visibly. Then softly, "Matthew Cole's parents." Silence crashed through the room. Interesting indeed. The vicar. Now things became very interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt stared sharply. "Reverend Cole is Thomas Vale's son?" "Yes." Interesting indeed. A hidden identity protected through 30 years of village silence. Remarkable indeed. "My father believed it merciful," Forsyth whispered. "Matthew never learned the truth until recently. And Clara discovered this." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the dark river outside. "Thomas Vale threatened exposing village corruption. Died mysteriously. And afterward his own child was raised unknowingly by the family connected to concealment. Interesting indeed. Human beings created tragic ironies beautifully." "But why murder Clara now?" asked the inspector sharply. "Matthew already knows." "Not entirely," Forsyth whispered. "Interesting indeed." "What do you mean?" The doctor closed his eyes briefly, then spoke almost unwillingly. "Matthew's father didn't merely hide Thomas Vale's death." His voice weakened. "He caused it deliberately." "Ah, interesting indeed. Not accident, then. Murder. True murder." Inspector Harcourt went still. "You knew?" "Yes." "How?" "My sister told me before dying." Interesting indeed. "She overheard everything beside the river that night." Forsyth swallowed hard. "Thomas confronted them publicly. Matthew's father struck him with a lantern during the argument." Silence settled once more. Interesting indeed. Harsh, simple violence, followed by 30 years of respectable silence. "And Harold Trent helped hide the body," Miss Marple said softly. Interesting indeed. The doctor looked suddenly ancient with guilt. "We convinced ourselves exposing it would destroy too many lives." He laughed bitterly once. "So Eldermere buried the truth instead." "Ah, yes. Villages excelled at burying truths." Inspector Harcourt folded Clara's unfinished letter carefully. "Did anyone besides Clara recently discover Matthew's real identity?" Dr. Forsyth hesitated. Then quietly, "Lydia Trent." Interesting indeed. "And?" She begged Clara, remaining silent. "Because Matthew's reputation would collapse," murmured Miss Marple softly. Interesting indeed. The beloved village vicar revealed secretly as the son of a murdered man raised by the murderer's family. Eldermere would certainly fear that scandal. But still something troubled Miss Marple deeply. Interesting indeed. Because none of this fully explained Clara's poisoning. Not quite. As they prepared leaving, Miss Marple noticed something curious near Dr. Forsyth's writing desk. A teacup. Ordinary enough, perhaps. Except beside it rested a small brown medicine bottle labelled Digitalis. Interesting indeed. The doctor noticed her gaze immediately. "For patients," he said quietly. "Of course. Interesting indeed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear doctor, did Clara Hensley visit you shortly before her death?" Stephen Forsyth froze almost imperceptibly. There it was. Interesting indeed. "Yes," he whispered finally. "And what did she want?" The doctor looked toward the rain-dark river once more. "She came asking whether poison can resemble heart failure." Silence settled softly through the cottage, and suddenly Miss Marple understood something chilling. Clara Hensley knew someone intended killing her before she ever drank the poisoned tea. The fear hidden behind kindness. The realization changed everything. Clara Hensley had not merely suspected danger after becoming ill. She feared murder beforehand. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple thought about it constantly while returning through Eldermere's damp evening lanes beside Inspector Harcourt. The village appeared almost unnaturally quiet beneath fading grey skies. Doors closed early, curtains remained drawn, and nobody lingered beside garden gates anymore. Interesting indeed. Fear had entered Eldermere openly now. Inspector Harcourt walked with visible frustration. If Clara expected poisoning, he muttered, why attend the church meeting at all? Interesting question indeed. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves thoughtfully. Perhaps because she hoped fear itself would prevent murder. The inspector frowned. You mean she believed someone wouldn't dare? Yes. Interesting indeed. Human beings frequently underestimated desperation, especially respectable, desperate people. And she still carried those letters, Harcourt said quietly, almost like protection. Interesting indeed. Protection through knowledge. A dangerous game, perhaps. They paused outside the churchyard gates where autumn leaves drifted across wet stone paths. Church bells echoed faintly through gathering darkness. Inspector Harcourt looked toward the vicarage windows. You still don't think Matthew Cole poisoned her? No. Interesting indeed. Why not? Because Matthew fears truth. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Murderers usually fear discovery more. Interesting indeed. The inspector studied her carefully. You suspect someone else entirely? Yes. Who? Miss Marple looked toward the silent village. I'm not certain yet. Which unfortunately remained true, because several things refused fitting neatly together. Lydia Trent clearly feared scandal. Dr. Forsyth concealed knowledge for decades. Arthur Bellamy lied repeatedly out of terror. Yet none entirely resembled cold, deliberate poisoners. Interesting indeed. That evening, Reverend Matthew Cole requested seeing Miss Marple privately at the church. The old building stood nearly empty except for candlelight flickering softly across ancient stone walls. Interesting indeed. Churches revealed guilt beautifully, perhaps. People entered them hoping silence might resemble forgiveness. Matthew Cole looked exhausted beyond words. You know the truth now, he said quietly. Part of it. The vicar lowered his eyes. My father murdered Thomas Vale. Interesting indeed. Directly spoken at last. And raised Thomas's son afterward. Matthew laughed bitterly. Yes. Extraordinary irony. Not irony, perhaps. Punishment. Miss Marple watched him gently. When did you learn the truth? 3 years ago. Interesting indeed. Your father confessed before dying? Yes. Matthew's voice weakened faintly. He said guilt finally became unbearable. Perhaps. Or perhaps fear of divine judgment frightened old men eventually. Interesting indeed. How did you feel afterward? Miss Marple asked softly. The vicar stared toward candlelight trembling near the altar. I hated him. His answer came immediately. Then I hated myself for hating him. Interesting indeed. Human emotions rarely behave tidily. And Thomas Vale? Matthew swallowed hard. I spent months imagining the life he lost. His voice trembled faintly. My life, perhaps. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple said gently, You are not responsible for your father's sins. No, Matthew whispered, but I've benefited from them every day. Interesting indeed. There it was, perhaps. The true burden. He had not inherited guilt exactly. Inherited comfort purchased through injustice. The vicar walked slowly toward the front pews. Clara wanted me telling the village everything publicly, and you refused. Yes. Why? Matthew turned toward her sharply. Because Eldermere would collapse under it. Ah, yes, again. The village must survive at all costs. Interesting indeed. Would truth truly destroy it? Asked Miss Marple softly. You don't understand these people. Matthew's voice rose slightly with emotion. Some families here have known one another generations. They survived war together, poverty together. He paused painfully. Their entire identity depends upon believing they are decent. Interesting indeed. Human beings often valued self-image above morality itself. Miss Marple spoke quietly. My dear Reverend Cole, people who require lies supporting decency are usually less decent than they imagine. Silence settled between them. Then suddenly Matthew whispered, I think Clara knew who poisoned her. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple looked sharply toward him. What makes you believe that? She told me something strange the afternoon before she died. The vicar sat heavily upon a pew. She said kindness can become cruelty if carried long enough. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple remained very still. Because yes, quite true indeed. Villagers protecting themselves through silence often convinced themselves silence was compassion. But eventually that kindness destroyed innocent people instead. What else did Clara say? Asked Miss Marple softly. Matthew hesitated. Then quietly, she said the wrong person had been protected all these years. Very interesting indeed. The wrong person. Meaning perhaps Eldamere misunderstood the entire past. Or protected someone besides Reverend Cole's father. Interesting indeed. Before Miss Marple could question further, sudden footsteps echoed sharply outside the church entrance. Inspector Harcourt appeared moments later looking grim. There's been another incident. Interesting indeed. Fear moved quickly now. What happened? Arthur Bellamy's cottage was broken into. Interesting indeed. The old railway clerk again. Was he harmed? No, but Clara's letters are gone. Very interesting indeed. They hurried immediately through darkening lanes toward Arthur Bellamy's small cottage near the edge of Eldamere. The front door hung partly open beneath weak lantern light, while constables moved quietly inside. Arthur himself sat trembling beside the fireplace wrapped in blankets. Interesting indeed. Fear had nearly destroyed him now. They came through the back, Inspector Harcourt explained quietly. Drawers emptied, papers scattered. Miss Marple moved slowly through the disordered room. Interesting indeed. The intruder searched carefully, not randomly, specifically for letters. Did you keep anything besides Clara's note? She asked Arthur gently. The old man nodded shakily. Yes. What? A photograph. Interesting indeed. What sort of photograph? Arthur swallowed hard. Thomas Vale beside Reverend Cole's father the night before he died. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt looked sharply toward him. You never mentioned this. I was frightened. Quite understandable, perhaps. What happened to it? Arthur looked miserable. They took it. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple examined overturned drawers thoughtfully, then suddenly noticed something curious near the broken writing desk. Mud. Interesting indeed. Not village lane mud. River mud. Dark and thick. Interesting indeed. Thomas Vale died beside the river. The hidden body presumably buried nearby. And now someone searching desperately for evidence carried fresh river mud into Arthur Bellamy's cottage. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple knelt slowly examining the marks more carefully. Then another detail struck her. The footprints were small. Very small. Interesting indeed. Not a large man, perhaps. Possibly a woman. Inspector Harcourt noticed her expression. What is it? Interesting footprints. The inspector crouched beside her. Could belong to anyone. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly. But perhaps not everyone. Interesting indeed. Lydia Trent wore narrow shoes exactly that size. But then so did several women in Eldamere. Interesting indeed. Arthur Bellamy suddenly spoke again from beside the fire. There's something else. Fear shook visibly through him now. The night Clara died, she argued with someone after the meeting ended. Miss Marple looked sharply toward him. You witnessed this? No. Arthur closed his eyes miserably. I heard voices outside. Whose voices? Clara's and... He hesitated painfully. Dr. Forsyth's. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt straightened immediately. What were they saying? Arthur swallowed hard. Clara kept repeating. You should have told him years ago. Interesting indeed. And Forsyth. He said, some truths destroy people. Again, truth treated like poison rather than healing. Interesting indeed. But something about the conversation struck Miss Marple suddenly. Very sharply indeed. Not fear of scandal, perhaps. Personal guilt. Deep personal guilt. And abruptly another possibility emerged quietly into place. Interesting indeed. What if Clara Hensley discovered not only Thomas Vale's murderer, but the identity of the person who betrayed him first. The betrayal before the murder. The idea remained with Miss Marple long after midnight. Not the murder itself, the betrayal before it. Interesting indeed, because murders rarely emerged from nowhere. Usually someone lied first, concealed first, betrayed first. Violence simply arrived later to protect what deception had already begun. And Clara Hensley, quiet, unnoticed Clara, seemed to have uncovered precisely that hidden beginning. The following morning dawned cold and pale across Eldamere. Frost-silvered cottage roofs while villagers moved through routines with strained politeness. Interesting indeed. No one spoke openly about Arthur Bellamy's burglary, yet everyone knew. Villagers always knew. Miss Marple sat beside Edith Warren's fire, reviewing every detail carefully. Thomas Vale threatened exposing wartime theft. Reverend Cole's father killed him beside the river. Harold Trent helped conceal the crime. Eldamere buried the truth beneath false heroism. Yet Clara believed the wrong person had been protected. Interesting indeed. Protected from what exactly? Inspector Harcourt arrived shortly before noon, carrying new frustration. We searched the riverbank this morning. Interesting indeed. And? No photograph. He removed gloves irritably, though we did discover something else. Interesting indeed. He placed a muddy object carefully upon the table, a small silver lighter. Miss Marple examined it quietly. Interesting indeed. Elegant, expensive perhaps, and engraved with initials. SF. Interesting indeed. Dr. Forsyth lost this recently, she asked softly. Yes, the inspector frowned deeply. Claims he dropped it days ago while walking. Possible, perhaps. Or convenient. Interesting indeed. Edith Warren looked nervous. You don't truly suspect Stephen Forsyth, Inspector Harcourt sighed. I suspect everyone now. Quite reasonable, perhaps. Miss Marple remained thoughtful. Inspector, did Thomas Vale and Eleanor Forsyth have a happy relationship? Harcourt blinked slightly. According to older villagers, very much so. Interesting indeed. And Stephen Forsyth? What about him? Was he close to Thomas? The inspector hesitated. They were childhood friends, apparently. Interesting indeed. Friends. Betrayal grew most poisonous between friends, perhaps. Miss Marple rose quietly. I think I should visit Dr. Forsyth again. The doctor received her alone at the riverside cottage while weak winter sunlight drifted across dark water beyond the windows. He looked exhausted. Interesting indeed. Guilt-aged people rapidly. Inspector Harcourt found your lighter near the river, Miss Marple said gently. Yes. No surprise visible. Interesting indeed. You've been searching there? The doctor looked toward the water silently. Then finally, yes. Why? For Thomas. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple waited quietly. Silence often forced truth eventually. Stephen Forsyth sat heavily near the fireplace. When Thomas disappeared, nobody searched properly. His voice sounded distant somehow. People accepted the official story too quickly. Interesting indeed. Because they preferred believing he died heroically. Yes. The doctor laughed bitterly once, or we were all cowards. Interesting, perhaps, because he included himself immediately. Miss Marple spoke softly. My dear doctor, what exactly did you do? For several moments he said nothing, then finally, I betrayed him. There it was. Interesting indeed. Not murder, perhaps, but betrayal certainly. How? Thomas trusted me completely. Forsyth closed his eyes briefly. He told me about the stolen ration supplies before confronting Matthew's father. Interesting indeed. And I warned Harold Trent. Silence settled heavily. Interesting indeed. Why? The doctor's voice weakened faintly. Because my father was involved too. Ah, very interesting indeed. Not merely Trent and Reverend Cole's father then. Dr. Forsyth's own family benefited from corruption too. Interesting indeed. Thomas intended exposing everyone. Yes. And you feared disgrace. Stephen Forsyth nodded miserably. I convinced myself Harold would calm things peacefully. He looked suddenly older than before. Instead, Thomas ended up dead. There it was. The betrayal before the murder. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple watched him gently. Did Clara discover your involvement? Yes. Recently? The doctor nodded faintly. She found letters proving I warned Harold Trent before the confrontation. Interesting indeed. And Clara threatened exposing this publicly. Yes. Miss Marple remained very still, because now motive sharpened clearly. Stephen Forsyth possessed perhaps the strongest reason fearing Clara's truth. Not merely family scandal, personal guilt. Yet something still felt incomplete. Interesting indeed. "Did you poison her?" asked Miss Marple softly. The doctor looked directly toward her. "No." Immediate answer again. Interesting indeed, and strangely believable perhaps. Not because innocent people never lied, but because genuine murderers rarely carried guilt so openly. Stephen Forsyth already lived beneath crushing remorse. Another killing would harden rather than weaken him. Interesting indeed. "She frightened me," he admitted quietly, "but I never wanted her dead." Miss Marple nodded slowly, then suddenly noticed something curious upon the mantelpiece. A framed photograph. Interesting indeed. Young Stephen Forsyth beside Thomas Vale, and another woman smiling beside the river years earlier. Eleanor Forsyth. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple stepped closer, examining it carefully. Then another detail struck her sharply. Very sharply indeed. The photograph was damaged. Specifically, one corner had been torn away. Interesting indeed. "Who was originally standing here?" she asked softly. The doctor went pale instantly. Interesting indeed. Slowly he answered, "Lydia Trent." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple turned toward him quietly. "You removed her from the picture?" "Yes." "Why?" Stephen Forsyth hesitated visibly, then whispered, "Because Lydia loved Thomas too." Silence settled once more. Interesting indeed. Now matters became considerably clearer. Lydia Trent, Thomas Vale, hidden love before war. Interesting indeed. Did Thomas return her feelings? No. The doctor smiled sadly. He loved Eleanor completely. Interesting indeed. Rejected affection lingering through decades perhaps. Dangerous indeed. And Harold Trent knew? Yes. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple folded her gloves thoughtfully. A jealous husband, a rejected woman, a betrayal by friends, and murder concealed beneath village respectability. Human beings complicated tragedies beautifully. Before she could continue, hurried footsteps sounded outside. Inspector Harcourt entered moments later looking grim. "Miss Marple, Lydia Trent's disappeared." Interesting indeed. "When?" "No one's seen her since early morning." Interesting indeed. Dr. Forsyth stood immediately. She wouldn't run. Perhaps not, Harcourt muttered darkly, but someone searched her house. Very interesting indeed. Again searching, again desperation for hidden evidence. They hurried together toward Ashcombe House standing beyond Eldermere's far hill, beneath cold afternoon skies. The elegant manor appeared unnaturally silent. Inside, rooms had clearly been disturbed, drawers emptied, cabinets opened, papers scattered across carpets. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt moved carefully through the disorder. Whoever searched here knew exactly what they wanted. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple wandered slowly into Lydia Trent's private sitting room. Books lined the walls neatly beside polished furniture. Elegant room. Controlled room. And yet one thing appeared terribly out of place. A burned paper fragment inside the fireplace. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the ashes. Most words destroyed completely, except several remaining lines. Thomas never trusted Stephen. He said someone close betrayed him. "I fear what Harold may do." Interesting indeed. A letter. Perhaps Eleanor Forsyth's handwriting. Perhaps proof Thomas suspected betrayal before death. Inspector Harcourt read over her shoulder grimly. This changes things. Yes. Interesting indeed. Because now another possibility emerged sharply into view. What if Clara Hensley discovered not only who killed Thomas Vale, but who allowed the murder happening by warning the killers beforehand? And what if someone feared that truth more than the murder itself? The body beneath the riverbank. Lydia Trent did not return that night. By morning, Eldermere had become a village trapped between fear and memory. People gathered in whispers outside shops, spoke quietly inside church porches, and watched strangers pass with guarded expressions. Interesting indeed. No one trusted anyone completely anymore, and perhaps they never truly had. Miss Marple stood beside Edith Warren's cottage window, shortly after dawn, watching fog drift slowly across the fields beyond the river. Inspector Harcourt had spent most of the night organising searches. For Lydia Trent, for the missing photograph, for anything connecting Clara Hensley's murder to Thomas Vale's long-hidden death. Interesting indeed. The inspector himself arrived exhausted near 9 o'clock. We found something. Interesting indeed. Not Lydia, perhaps. His face suggested worse. The riverbank collapsed during the storm near Miller's Bridge. Harcourt removed wet gloves slowly. A body was uncovered. Silence settled softly through the cottage. Interesting indeed. Even Edith Warren seemed unsurprised somehow. Villagers carrying secrets often expected corpses eventually. "Thomas Vale?" asked Miss Marple gently. The inspector nodded once. "Yes." Interesting indeed. After 30 years beneath mud and river roots, Eldermere's buried truth had finally risen naturally to the surface. Quite poetic, perhaps. An hour later, Miss Marple stood near the river while constables worked quietly around the exposed remains beneath grey skies. Villagers watched from a distance in frightened silence. Interesting indeed. Thomas Vale had finally come home. Inspector Harcourt approached slowly. The skull fracture matches Matthew Cole's father striking him. He paused grimly. But there's something else. Interesting indeed. What? Thomas wasn't buried immediately. Harcourt lowered his voice. Evidence suggests the body remained elsewhere for several days first. Very interesting indeed. Miss Marple looked toward the river thoughtfully, meaning multiple people likely handled the body after death. Multiple opportunities for betrayal and concealment. Interesting indeed. Where was he kept? She asked softly. We're not sure yet. But Miss Marple suddenly possessed a quiet suspicion. Churches, cellars, old barns. Villages hid bodies temporarily in surprisingly ordinary places. Interesting indeed. Before further discussion continued, movement near the gathered villagers caught Miss Marple's attention. Lydia Trent. Interesting indeed. She stood pale-faced beneath dark coat and scarf while villagers stared openly now. Interesting perhaps because she did not appear frightened anymore, only tired. Inspector Harcourt moved immediately toward her. Mrs. Trent, where have you been? London. Interesting indeed. Without informing anyone? Yes. Lydia looked directly toward the riverbank where Thomas Vale's remains rested beneath white covering. For one brief moment, genuine grief crossed her face. Interesting indeed. Not fear, not guilt, loss. I needed thinking time, she said quietly. The inspector studied her carefully. Your house was searched. I know. Interesting indeed. You know, I returned early this morning. Miss Marple watched her closely. Interesting indeed. Lydia no longer resembled someone protecting reputation desperately. She resembled someone exhausted by decades of silence. Inspector Harcourt spoke sharply. Did you remove evidence from your house before leaving? No. Did you poison Clara Hensley? Lydia closed her eyes briefly. No. Interesting indeed. Again, immediate denial. And strangely sincere, perhaps. The inspector clearly felt uncertain too. What were you doing in London? Lydia hesitated, then quietly. Visiting a solicitor? Interesting indeed. Why? To prepare a public statement. Interesting indeed. Finally, perhaps. Or Lydia looked toward Miss Marple. I intended confessing everything. Interesting, perhaps, because murderers rarely volunteered scandals, destroying themselves. What changed your mind? Asked Miss Marple softly. Lydia smiled sadly. Thomas Vale's body. She glanced toward the river again. There's no point hiding ghosts once they begin rising. Quite true indeed. Later that afternoon, Inspector Harcourt gathered key witnesses inside the church hall where Clara Hensley died. Interesting indeed. The same tables remained there still, the same chairs, even the same polished tea service. Human beings rarely altered surroundings after tragedy, perhaps because routine comforted them. Present now, Lydia Trent, Dr. Stephen Forsyth, Arthur Bellamy, Reverend Matthew Cole, Miss Marple, Inspector Harcourt, and silence. Interesting indeed. The inspector began firmly. Thomas Vale's death is officially classified murder. He paused heavily. We now know several people concealed that crime for decades. No one argued. Interesting indeed. However, Harcourt continued sharply, Clara Hensley's poisoning remains unsolved. Ah, there it was. Because despite old scandals and buried bodies, one fact remained terribly modern. Someone recently murdered Clara deliberately. Inspector Harcourt turned toward Lydia Trent first. You admitted visiting Clara's cottage secretly, searching for letters. Why? Because I feared Matthew's life would be destroyed. Interesting indeed. The vicar lowered his eyes silently. Inspector Harcourt shifted toward Dr. Forsyth. You warned Harold Trent before Thomas confronted him, meaning your betrayal indirectly caused murder? The doctor nodded miserably. Interesting indeed. Then Harcourt turned sharply toward Arthur Bellamy. You possessed Clara's letters secretly. Arthur trembled visibly, and lied repeatedly during investigation. Interesting indeed. Fear everywhere, guilt everywhere, yet perhaps not murder. Inspector Harcourt sighed heavily. One of you still poisoned Clara Hensley. Silence followed. Interesting indeed. Then unexpectedly Reverend Matthew Cole spoke quietly. No. Everyone turned toward him. Interesting indeed. No, repeated Harcourt sharply. Matthew looked pale but calm somehow. The person who poisoned Clara isn't in this room. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt frowned deeply. What makes you say that? The vicar hesitated, then slowly removed something from his coat pocket. A letter. Interesting indeed. I found this beneath Clara's church hall chair after she collapsed, Matthew said softly. I kept it hidden because I feared what it meant. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple accepted the paper carefully. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Clara. If Stephen Forsyth finally confesses publicly, the truth about Thomas may at last bring peace. But I still fear one person more than the others, someone who has remained quiet for too long. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple read the final line twice. Someone who has remained quiet for too long. Not Lydia Trent, perhaps. Not Stephen Forsyth. Both argued openly with Clara recently. Quiet, interesting indeed. Arthur Bellamy, perhaps? No, too frightened. Then suddenly another thought emerged sharply. Very sharply indeed. Clara Hensley herself had been quiet for years. Yet eventually she spoke, meaning perhaps she recognized the same dangerous silence in someone else. Miss Marple looked slowly around the church hall, then toward the tea service resting neatly upon the side table. Interesting indeed. Who prepared the tea the night Clara died? She asked softly. Matthew answered immediately. I did. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. But who arranged the cups beforehand? Silence followed briefly. Then Lydia Trent spoke. Mrs. Agnes Fuller. Interesting indeed. The dress shop owner. Quiet. Forgettable. Always present. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple remembered Agnes Fuller's nervousness immediately. The trembling hands. The frightened eyes. Not fear of old scandals, perhaps. Fear of present guilt. Inspector Harcourt looked sharply toward her. You suspect Agnes Fuller? Perhaps. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple folded Clara's final note carefully, because suddenly something terrible became clear at last. Everyone in Eldermere focused upon the dramatic old murder beside the river, but Clara Hensley may have discovered something far simpler. The person poisoning her was not protecting the past. The person was protecting themselves. The woman no one noticed. The realization settled over the church hall slowly like winter fog. Agnes Fuller, interesting indeed. Not powerful Lydia Trent, not tortured Stephen Forsyth, not Reverend Cole with his inherited guilt. No, the quiet dress shop owner everyone overlooked. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt frowned sharply. Agnes Fuller. He glanced around the room. Why would she poison Clara Hensley? Miss Marple folded her hands gently. Because Clara finally recognized her. Silence followed. Interesting indeed. Matthew Cole looked confused. Recognized her as what? Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and walked toward the tea service standing untouched near the wall. Ordinary cups, ordinary silver spoons, ordinary teapot. Murder rarely required dramatic surroundings, perhaps. Interesting indeed. "My dear Inspector," she said softly, "everyone in Eldermere became obsessed with Thomas Vale's death, yet Clara's final note suggests she feared someone entirely different. Interesting indeed. Someone quiet for too long." "She wasn't speaking about Lydia Trent or Dr. Forsyth," Miss Marple continued. "Those people carried visible guilt already. Clara meant a quieter person. Someone who survived by remaining unnoticed. Very interesting indeed." Arthur Bellamy suddenly looked uneasy. "You think Agnes knew about Thomas Vale?" "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "More than knew, perhaps." Inspector Harcourt crossed his arms impatiently. "Explain." Miss Marple looked toward Lydia Trent first. "You said Thomas Vale's body remained hidden elsewhere before burial." "Yes." "Where?" Lydia hesitated visibly, then softly. "In the church cellar." "Interesting indeed." Several people looked shocked, though Miss Marple was not surprised. Churches possessed many forgotten spaces beneath them. "And who had access to the cellar?" asked Miss Marple quietly. Matthew answered slowly, "My father, Harold Trent." He paused thoughtfully. "And Agnes Fuller's husband." Interesting indeed. The room grew very still. Mrs. Agnes Fuller had been widowed for nearly 30 years, a quiet woman, a forgettable woman, exactly the sort villagers stopped truly seeing after enough time passed. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple continued softly. "Agnes Fuller's husband helped move Thomas Vale's body," Arthur Bellamy whispered. "Dear God. Yes. Interesting indeed." Inspector Harcourt frowned deeply. "But that still doesn't explain poisoning Clara now." "No." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because the real secret wasn't Thomas Vale's death itself." Interesting indeed. She turned toward Dr. Forsyth. "Thomas suspected someone betrayed him before confronting Harold Trent." The doctor lowered his eyes miserably. "Yes." "You believed that person was yourself?" "Yes." "Because you warned Harold?" "Of course." "Interesting indeed." Miss Marple nodded gently. "But Thomas already knew someone else betrayed him first." Silence. Interesting indeed. Lydia Trent stared sharply toward her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple looked toward the church doorway thoughtfully. "Thomas Vale told Eleanor Forsyth he trusted nobody except one person." She paused softly. "Agnes Fuller." "Ah, interesting indeed." Inspector Harcourt blinked. "The dressmaker." "Yes. Interesting indeed. Agnes and Thomas grew up together. She adored him quietly for years." Miss Marple smiled sadly. One of those invisible village devotions people rarely notice. Lydia Trent whispered softly, "Oh, interesting indeed." "She knew Thomas intended exposing the ration theft publicly," Miss Marple continued, "and she feared scandal would destroy Eldermere." A slight pause. "So she warned Reverend Cole's father before the confrontation." There it was. The first betrayal. Interesting indeed. Dr. Forsyth looked stunned. "You mean, she warned them before I did?" "Yes." Interesting indeed. "You merely confirmed Thomas was coming," said Miss Marple gently. "But Agnes Fuller first revealed his intentions." Silence filled the church hall completely now. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harcourt frowned sharply. "How could Clara know this?" Miss Marple answered quietly, "Through letters." "Ah, yes. Always letters. Interesting indeed." Clara discovered old correspondence hidden inside redirected postal records. She looked toward Matthew Cole. One letter written by Agnes Fuller immediately before Thomas died. Interesting indeed. "What did it say?" whispered Lydia. Miss Marple's voice softened slightly. It warned Reverend Cole's father that Thomas intended exposing everyone within days." Silence again. Heavy silence. Interesting indeed. Arthur Bellamy closed his eyes painfully. "She caused it." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Indirectly, perhaps, but yes." Interesting indeed. And afterward Thomas Vale died. The body hidden. The village buried truth beneath respectable silence, while Agnes Fuller remained unnoticed. Safe. For 30 years. Inspector Harcourt spoke sharply. "But why poison Clara now instead of simply admitting everything?" Miss Marple looked sadly toward the rain-dark windows. "Because Agnes convinced herself she acted out of kindness." Interesting indeed. She truly believed exposing the scandal would ruin innocent families after the war. Miss Marple paused gently. And once people build identities around moral sacrifice, they become frightened of discovering they were merely cowardly. Interesting indeed. Lydia Trent whispered bitterly, "So she killed Clara, protecting the same lie again." Yes. Interesting indeed. The pattern repeated itself, beautifully tragic perhaps. One betrayal becoming decades of silence. Then another murder protecting that silence once more. Inspector Harcourt moved toward the doorway immediately. Where is Agnes Fuller now? No one answered. Interesting indeed. Then suddenly Arthur Bellamy spoke weakly. She closes the shop early Thursdays. Interesting indeed. The inspector hurried out instantly with 2 constables behind him. Silence remained afterward inside the church hall. Interesting indeed. No triumph now, only exhaustion. Miss Marple sat quietly once more beside the empty teacups. Matthew Cole looked pale beyond words. "All these years," he whispered. "We blamed my father alone. Interesting indeed." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "Your father still committed murder." "Yes, but villages prefer simple villains." She folded her gloves softly. "Truth is usually more crowded." "Quite true indeed." Dr. Forsyth stared toward the floor miserably. "We all protected her." "Interesting indeed." Because yes, Eldamere protected Agnes Fuller unknowingly for decades precisely because she appeared harmless. Quiet widows, polite shopkeepers, invisible women. Villages trusted such people instinctively. Interesting indeed. Nearly an hour passed before Inspector Harcourt returned. His face alone revealed the outcome before he spoke. They found her. Interesting indeed. And? Dead. Silence settled softly across the church hall. Agnes Fuller had been discovered inside her tiny dress shop upstairs apartment, seated calmly beside the window overlooking Eldamere Lane. A bottle of digitalis rested beside untouched tea. Interesting indeed. Suicide, perhaps, or final surrender. The inspector handed Miss Marple a folded note recovered from the scene. She read silently. "I only wanted peace. Thomas would have destroyed everyone after the war. Clara would have destroyed them again now. Someone had to protect the village from truth. There it was. The terrible heart of Eldamere. Not hatred, not greed, not madness. The belief that lies could protect goodness. Interesting indeed." Miss Marple folded the note carefully while church bells echoed faintly through gathering evening darkness. Agnes Fuller spent 30 years convincing herself betrayal had been mercy, then committed murder to preserve that illusion, and perhaps that was the saddest thing of all. The silence the village chose. Winter arrived early in Eldamere. Within days, pale frost covered the village lanes each morning, while chimney smoke drifted softly above cottages beneath cold grey skies. Life resumed gradually as it always did after tragedy. The bakery reopened at dawn. Children returned noisily to school. Church bells rang every evening with steady certainty. And yet something invisible had changed forever. Interesting indeed. People spoke more quietly now, looked at one another more carefully, and avoided saying Agnes Fuller's name altogether. Quite typical, perhaps. Villages often preferred dead murderers becoming ghosts immediately. Miss Marple sat beside Edith Warren's fire on her final evening in Eldamere, while rain tapped gently against dark windows. Edith knitted silently for several minutes before finally sighing deeply. "I still can't believe Agnes Fuller. Interesting indeed." "Yes. She always seemed so harmless," the familiar phrase again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Most dangerous people usually do." Quite true indeed. Edith lowered her needles sadly. "I keep thinking about Thomas Vale." She paused. "All those years forgotten beneath the river. Interesting perhaps because now at last someone remembered him properly." Miss Marple stirred tea thoughtfully. "No one truly forgot him." Edith looked surprised. "No. People remembered constantly." Miss Marple glanced toward the firelight softly. That was the trouble. Interesting indeed. Because hidden guilt preserved memory beautifully. More beautifully perhaps than love itself. The following morning, Reverend Matthew Cole conducted a small memorial service beside the churchyard for Thomas Vale. No grand ceremony, no speeches for newspapers, only villagers standing quietly beneath cold winter skies while church bells echoed softly across Eldamere. Interesting indeed. Thomas Vale finally received a grave bearing his actual death date instead of heroic fiction. Truth at last, perhaps. Late truth. but truth nonetheless. Miss Marple stood near the back watching villagers carefully. Lydia Trent appeared older now somehow, though calmer perhaps. Dr. Forsyth looked deeply exhausted but strangely relieved. Arthur Bellamy trembled throughout the service, yet kept his eyes fixed firmly upon Thomas Vale's new gravestone. Interesting indeed. And Matthew Cole? Interesting indeed. The vicar no longer resembled a man crushed beneath inherited secrets. Pain remained, certainly. But something else existed now too. Freedom, perhaps. After the service, he approached Miss Marple quietly while villagers drifted slowly away through frosted paths. "I'm leaving Eldermere." "Interesting indeed." "Really?" "Yes." Matthew smiled faintly, though sadness lingered beneath it. "I don't think I belong here anymore." Interesting, perhaps, because now he finally understood Eldermere completely. Villages that buried truth eventually buried people too. "What will you do?" asked Miss Marple gently. "I don't know." He glanced toward Thomas Vale's grave softly. "Perhaps discover who I actually am." Interesting indeed. The son of a murdered man raised by the murderer. A tragic beginning, perhaps, but not necessarily tragic ending. Miss Marple touched his sleeve kindly. "My dear Matthew, people are not responsible for the sins surrounding their birth." "No," he said quietly. "But perhaps they are responsible for what they choose afterward." "Quite true indeed." Before leaving, Matthew handed her a small envelope. "Clara wrote this shortly before her death." His voice lowered slightly. "She asked me giving it to you if anything happened." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple opened the letter slowly after returning to Edith Warren's cottage later that afternoon. Clara Hensley's handwriting remained careful and modest even in final thoughts. "Dear Miss Marple, if you're reading this, then perhaps Eldermere finally chose truth after all. I used to believe quietness was safety. People ignored me so completely that I convinced myself silence protected everyone. But silence does not protect goodness. It protects whatever people fear losing most." Interesting indeed. Miss Marple continued reading softly beside the window, while winter rain drifted across the village outside. Thomas Vale died because several frightened people each committed one small act of cowardice. Agnes warned the wrong men. Stephen stayed silent. Others hid the body. Then the village created a prettier story because living with truth seemed too painful. Perhaps evil rarely begins dramatically. Perhaps it simply grows whenever ordinary people decide honesty is inconvenient. Very interesting indeed. The final lines appeared shakier. "I do not hate Eldermere. That is the saddest part. Most people here are kind. But kindness without courage becomes dangerous eventually." Miss Marple folded the letter quietly. "Yes, exactly. Interesting indeed." That evening Inspector Harcourt arrived one final time before her departure. The poor man looked considerably older than when the investigation began. Villagers had that effect, perhaps. "Agnes Fuller left a full confession," he said heavily, while accepting tea from Edith Warren. "Everything matches your conclusions. Interesting indeed." "She admitted warning Reverend Cole's father before Thomas confronted him," the inspector continued, "and poisoning Clara after discovering the letters." Miss Marple nodded softly. Inspector Harcourt stared thoughtfully into the fire. "She genuinely believed she was protecting innocent people." "Yes, but she destroyed innocent people instead." "Quite true indeed." The inspector sighed heavily. "I suppose villagers create these things." "Not villages," Miss Marple corrected gently. "People?" "Interesting indeed. Human beings everywhere preferred comfortable lies sometimes. Cities simply hid it better." Before leaving, Harcourt paused near the doorway. "One thing still troubles me." "Yes." "Why did Clara wait so many years before speaking?" "Interesting indeed." Miss Marple looked toward rain-dark windows thoughtfully. "Because she loved the village too." Silence followed softly. And perhaps that was the deepest tragedy of all. Clara Hensley spent years believing protecting Eldermere mattered more than justice. By the time she finally understood silence itself had become cruelty, it was already too late. After Inspector Harcourt departed, Edith Warren spoke quietly beside the fire. "Do you think Eldermere will recover?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, yes." She glanced toward the peaceful village beyond the window. "Villages recover from almost everything." Interesting indeed. Murders faded, scandals softened, and eventually new flowers grew above old graves. Human beings possessed remarkable talent for continuing ordinary life beside terrible memories. Yet somewhere beneath Eldermere's calm routines, people would forever remember one uncomfortable truth. The greatest danger had never come from strangers, not from violent outsiders, not from mysterious criminals. It came instead from ordinary decent people choosing silence because truth felt inconvenient. And perhaps that was why Miss Marple found the entire business so very sad, because evil rarely arrived wearing monstrous faces. More often it arrived politely, speaking softly about kindness while asking everyone to say nothing at all.